отца, ни матери. Живу в законе. Я по воровскому закону жил, живу и буду жить.
Поэтому свободное место на твоей груди, на коленях будет заполнено звездами.
Я умер, когда мне было 15. Я мертвец. Сейчас я круглые сутки на зоне.
Hello, and welcome to another attempt for me to understand this crazy world. For this week I've decided to read The Vory by Galeotti, who has done extensive work in studying Russia's history and examined its place within international relations and security. Though this book dealt with a particular pet interest of his, and I will admit, of mine, which is the history and impact of organized crime within Russia. Overall, the book attempts to explain what makes Russian criminal networks unique, and why they appear to be so influential within modern Russian life. Now, I will stress that this is not a particularly deep exploration of the ideas of the book, nor is this a robust examination of the Russian criminal network. Rather, these are just some main takeaways I got from the book, mostly to reinforce my own reading. Afterwards, I'll also link in some of what I've learned with interesting portrayals in media, especially Hotel Moscow and the show Black Lagoon. I will say that the show is confusingly accurate, which is to say that it's clearly a mythologized version of Russian criminals, but many of those myths do come from historical precedents. As it is, though, if you do want a more robust breakdown, I have linked my notes within the description, which contains my thoughts as I was reading, a group of quotes I found relevant, and 2 different lectures given by Galeotti, the author. Still, let's start with part 1 of the book. Many of the foundations of the modern Russian criminal are actually much more recent than some other groups within the world, including many of the mafia groups that operate in Japan, Sicily, or even the United States. Though there is plenty of history regarding the banditi, or bandits of Tsarist Russia. Many of these were typically small bandit groups that would either roam the countryside or operate out of small townships for basic racketeering rings. Every now and again, there would be a more robust network created to ship stolen goods down the Volga, the largest river in Russia and Europe, but they were often temporary. Where these bandit groups started to gain notoriety was during the rise of communist revolt groups in Russia, as they would often need to rely on less than legal means to secure funding or for supplies or what have you for planned campaigns against the Tsarist forces. There was even a bank robbery that was planned by Lenin and Stalin in 1907, which they've often denied because it was not a popular decision by the rest of the wider socialist movement. Still, much of this was essentially opportunistic, more so than the organized network that we understand today. Where we first saw organized Russian crime actually arise was during the era of Stalin's reign, especially within the gulags. This was also the first time that there was something that could be called the Vorovskoy Mir, meaning the thieves' world, or the Vorovskoy Zakon, meaning the thieves' code. This is also where we see many of the customs and traditions of Russian criminal life begin to appear, some of which would survive to present day. It was in the gulags where the visual language of tattoos were made, usually to denote what you were in for, what crimes you had committed, or what services you could provide. What defined the Vorovskoy Mir, for the most part, was the desire to leave the mainstream. To be a vor, or thief, was to denounce what normal Russians were supposed to believe in, and to adopt the new rules and principles of the Vory v Zakone, or thieves in code. While there was never a rulebook one could read, the code was often kept by senior prison members, who would often enforce and arbitrate it to others. Among many other rules, there was usually one supreme law of the thief: never work with the state. Anyone found doing so would be lucky to come away with their lives. Yet much of this began to change when Stalin died, and many of the original prisoners would begin to be released. In part 2, much of the book's focus is on the years between Stalin's death and when Putin came into power. In the years immediately following Stalin's death, there was a massive release of prisoners back into the Russian citizenry. In the late 1950s and the 60s, this led to a massive upheaval for most of the local communities, many of which were not prepared for the wave of thieves. Generally, this led to the first major clashes between the Soviet government and the growing underworld of criminals, as some of the more violent elements of the Vory sought to fight directly against the government. Yet most of the newly freed Vory tried to establish more robust networks, utilizing the connections they had made in the gulags to find new opportunities. And the biggest opportunities were in the black markets that had arisen during Stalin's reign, which the Soviet police were more than willing to turn a blind eye to. What started from this was a precarious symbiotic relationship, where connected criminals began to establish networks for smuggling, bootlegging, and moonshining, and the authorities would let them be if they didn't step on their toes. Sometimes it was state actors that would use the services of these criminals, much like during Prohibition in the United States. Essentially, the beginning of the relationship between the Russian state and the Russian underworld started to form. Yet, it was some of the later reforms made by Brezhnev and Gorbachev that solidified many of these relationships, and even made the public far more receptive to the criminals overall. The most substantial of these were the reforms that attempted to curtail the problem of alcoholism, including limiting when alcohol could be sold, who could sell alcohol, or who could produce alcohol. Unfortunately, much like Prohibition in the US, this meant that the average person would often turn to pre-existing criminal groups to supply their alcohol. The most interesting effect of this was that much of the public began to view members of the criminal underworld as if they were respected members of the community. It wouldn't be surprising for a normal citizen to buy alcohol from a gang member and simultaneously ask them where they could get their shoes fixed, or to ask for advice about raising children. While there's something comedic about the image, it was actually quite a big shift in how relaxed the average citizen became regarding the presence of criminals in their community. Since then, the presence of gangs or criminal networks has almost become an accepted fact for most citizens. So, whenever a movement tends to start against organized crime, it becomes increasingly difficult to mobilize people for the cause, leading to the problem becoming more endemic. Yet the final nail in the coffin was the increased interpenetration between the criminal networks and legitimate businesses. While the groundwork for this was laid down during the waning years of the Soviet Union, it was the rapid shift towards capital markets under Yeltsin that allowed for a now vast criminal network to expand rapidly and often quite violently. In the first place, the relaxing or dissolution of many Soviet economic principles often meant that there wasn't a robust regulatory system in place to deal with overly aggressive market strategies, or sudden conglomeration and rapid integration. This was true for both legitimate and illegitimate businesses, which often meant that the most aggressive players were the ones that won out during the 1990s, and often, legitimate and illegitimate business would mix, making it difficult to tell which was which. For example, criminals would often start a legitimate business, such as a private security firm, which would often front for illegitimate business, such as protection racketeering. The rapid integration between these two sides of the economy meant that by the time the new millennium came around, any effort to pull out the criminals meant that you'd likely be pulling apart several legitimate businesses, harming a significant portion of innocent citizens that didn't know they were working for a criminal network. The roots of the problem became even more difficult to grab a hold of. Part 3 of the book explains how much of this began to manifest within the 2000s, and the different types of criminal organizations that are present today in Russia. To begin with, there was the shift in policy taken by Putin when he took power in 1999. Outwardly, Putin made a big deal of fighting against crime, and there were legitimate efforts to root out the more violent groups. Yet, a secondary policy began to take shape, where a blind eye was turned to other criminal groups, as long as they didn't interfere with the business of the state. In many ways, this reflected some of Stalin's principles when it came to the black market. For the most part, this helped to create many of the policies that are still in use today for criminal organizations. While it was common to have an opponent killed by drive-by or car bomb in the 1990s, the crackdown on overt violence meant that most methods to remove opponents became more economic in nature, usually by bullying out your competitor, though assassinations still occur frequently enough, though these are usually now more precise and less dangerous for the average citizen. For the most part, though, the majority of criminal activity in Russia now mirrors much of the legitimate business world, where disputes are handled by arbitration or contract making, and different groups usually seek to find a workable solution. One of the two big examples of this is the Eastern Association of Thieves, which acted like a trade guild for various gangs along the eastern coast of Russia, though their position is a bit more precarious with the growth of Chinese criminal groups in the region. The other is the massive heroin routes that connect the Afghan opium production market to Europe. Roughly 30% of the world's heroin trade travels from Afghanistan through Russia, where it eventually goes west to Europe and east to China. The route is essentially comprised of various smaller groups who make agreements on what they are allowed to take for themselves and what they are required to pass along. Much like a semi-connected distribution chain in legitimate production. While they are big players in the Russian criminal underworld, they are now more akin to CEOs than the old image of mob bosses. It also doesn't help that many of the larger players, now known as the autoriteti, or authorities, were usually big players within legitimate business, often crossing paths with state actors. Sometimes it's too difficult to tell who's an honest businessman and who's moonlighting as one. Part 4 examines how, over time, the concept of the Vorovskoy Mir changed, and how those changes now represent much of the difficulty in categorizing crime and criminal networks in Russia. Originally, the old Gulag code of refusing to work with the state guided many decisions made by early Vory. Yet, over the next few decades, the integration between state actors and criminal elements started to break down, with the modern day having the autoriteti, who often operate in both circles. Now, does this mean that crime runs Russia? Not to the extent that is commonly believed. The relationship appears to be more of an uneasy symbiosis. The state ignores crime if it doesn't interfere with the Kremlin, and may even be rewarded if it helps the state. Yet, if a particular group tries to get too large, or violence starts to increase, then the state will often come in like a hammer, even if just to preserve its image. On the other hand, though, there often appear to be coincidental deals made between the Kremlin and criminals that at least make other countries nervous. For example, the annexation of Crimea appeared to coincidentally coincide with a temporary easing of tensions among criminal groups in Odessa, who ended up gaining territory from rivals that tended to operate more inland in Ukraine. Or how many cyber attacks beneficial for the Kremlin appeared to come from hacker groups that suddenly have more capabilities than they showed previously. While there is nothing definitive to point to, there is enough to believe that the Kremlin will not shy away from utilizing criminal networks for their own benefit. For the most part, the question of Russian crime is one that doesn't have a definitive answer, and the effects that it has on other nations within Eastern Europe are proving to be difficult for those nations to deal with. Yet, there are those who attempt to do what they can and do have hope for the future. While there may not be any clear answers or a way forward, there is still hope that these problems can be dealt with. Maybe not tomorrow, but someday, hopefully soon. Now, before we get to my final thoughts, let's get to that one thing that I said we would, which is the Russian Mafia within media overall, but especially Hotel Moscow within Black Lagoon. More specifically, how well does Hotel Moscow stack up to the actual real-life Russian Mafia? Well, as I said before, it's confusingly accurate. Now, this isn't a full dive, there might be work being done for that, but that'll be much, much later. But as for being confusingly accurate, for one, let's start with the whole disgraced battalion aspect. Certainly, there were Afghansi, meaning Russian soldiers from Afghanistan who came back after the war and felt betrayed by their own country. Many veterans actually had a hard time getting the benefits that they were promised, including severance pay or healthcare services, and this would turn a decent number of these veterans to crime. They were especially prominent in the lower levels of crime, providing protection and intimidation services. Very few would make it big, however, and the ones that did would often act as contractors for other gangs. Having a whole battalion become an organized gang was essentially unheard of, but it's not impossible. It's more a fanciful interpretation. In addition to that, Black Lagoon is set at some point in the 1990s. Besides one date given specifically, it's a bit unclear how the events line up with one another. Regardless, was there a massive outpouring of Russian crime to the world? Did the Russian Mafia establish itself globally? Well, plenty of people thought so. Members of the US Congress certainly talked about the fear of a global Russian Mafia infiltrating the United States. As it is, though, that didn't really happen in the way that people think. For the most part, Russian criminals that operate outside of Russia aren't really connected to the criminal networks within Russia. They essentially operate on their own. Now, this was new, as before the 90s, it was near impossible for a mafia to come into the territory of another without being wiped out. If you were part of the Sicilian Mafia and you wanted to move into Spain, you had to contend with the mafia that was already in Spain. Usually this didn't work out, and either one or the other was just completely pushed out. But what the Russians did differently was that they didn't take territory. Instead, they acted as contractors and business partners, usually for services that the local gangs couldn't do themselves. In Europe, this usually meant offering smuggling and money laundering. In South America, it was access to heroin trade routes in exchange for cocaine. It's a bit unclear if they've established footholds in Africa, China, or Southeast Asia. The furthest it appears they've gone, within Asia specifically, is Afghanistan. So, would there be a group operating out of Thailand? Possibly. But there really isn't a lot of data to be able to say so definitively. So, what does Hotel Moscow do in the show? Well, are they territory grabbers, taking as much property as they can? No. Actually, most of the crime groups in Roanapur seem to have an uneasy agreement to leave territory alone. Instead, it seems that Hotel Moscow just operates sections of drug trade. They'll hire the Lagoon Company for smuggling jobs, and it looks like they do some protection and intimidation services like they did with the Yakuza in Fujiyama Gangsta Paradise. Although that was certainly more over the top than most Russian criminals would operate these days, especially outside of Russia. All in all, there is a decent amount of lineup between what Hotel Moscow is in Black Lagoon and how the Russian Mafia operated in foreign countries during the 1990s. Clearly, it's exaggerated, almost like a mythological version of the Russian Mafia, but there is some parallels. Again, it's confusingly accurate for what most people basically treat as a turn-your-brain-off action show. At the very least, it does suggest that Hiraway, the author, did some research into the real-life Russian criminal underground. Honestly, props to him. As for other usually more grounded depictions of Russian criminal life, there are a decent handful of Russian movies that portray the Mafia. Just as Americans are fascinated by figures like Al Capone, the Russians love making movies and singing songs about their criminals. The most famous example, and one that's still immensely popular, is Brat, meaning brother, made in 1997. It's a far more bleak and honest take of the wild days of the 1990s, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone. Not so much for Brat 2, but it's not the worst. I'd also recommend the movie Antikiller, Antikiller, pretty much, made in 2002. It's a more action-orientated, it's a very low-budget crime movie, mostly about a vigilante fighting the mob while they're having a gang warfare. But it got some decent praise for having some actual accuracy when it came to hierarchies within the criminal underworld. Finally, there's also, in Russian, it's Leviathan, specifically Leviathan. That one was made in 2014, and it's not strictly a mafia movie. Its focus was more on the creeping corruption of politics, specifically in a small town in somewhere eastern Russia. I can't remember the town specifically, but it's essentially that the corruption had made its way so deep that the average person started to go a bit insane. It's a rather bleak outlook, but it was popular and it certainly gained a following for that. So, what did I get out of this book? Why did I study it? Why did I think this would help with my studies overall? Well, forgive me for a bit of backstory, but probably helps in this situation. I grew up in a military family. My grandfather actually served in Vietnam, and my father served in the Gulf War. The school I went to was actually in a small town that was built during the nuclear panic, and as such it had a bomb shelter. And actually, there are plenty of times where my mother would sit there and talk about the sort of fear and terror that she felt in the idea of just a nuclear bomb wiping them out. Every time the news would talk about Russia, my father would just say, they're biding their time. They're gonna hit us. I swear to God, they're just waiting, man. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories and whatnot about how the Soviet Union didn't actually go away where I grew up. Just sort of this idea that Russia was still there. An especially popular one was the idea of the Russian Mafia. They were getting into our towns. Man, we used to have honest mafia. Honestly, I did grow up in an Italian mafia town, and the idea of the Russian Mafia taking over was apparently this big thing. I don't know. I didn't get it. But around the time I was 8 years old, the September 11th attack actually happened, and that was a rough one for, if you grew up in New York, that was a rough one for a lot of people, and especially being 8 years old, it was suddenly that the world opened up, and it was really, really difficult to understand just the difference between this sort of innocent child world and then suddenly just everything blowing up. But I do remember just a lot of conversations that people would have about how this was a front for Russia, or that the reason Al-Qaeda was even as powerful as it was because we gave them the weapons when they were the Mujahideen that fought against the Soviet forces. No matter what, the whole idea of the Cold War, and especially the Soviet Union, kept popping up. I might have been born in the time that technically the Cold War was over, but for a lot of people it really felt like the Cold War never ended. It just kind of went into the background. And especially nowadays, if you check out the news, there's plenty of people who are talking about the new Cold War. For some people, it appears that was inevitable. But that is kind of what it is. Somewhere in my teenage years, I came up with the idea of like, hey, if Russia is going to be a big deal, maybe I should learn Russian. More than a decade. It's been a decade, and I could barely read a news article, so still working on that. But overall, because of this, just because even growing up, just the ghost of the Cold War had always been there was always this kind of interest of like, what even happened? in that whole time period, that weird like 100 years, the world seemed to shift, and it set down essentially an entire framework for people to understand global politics. And I don't know. Anything that has to do with that is always kind of interesting to me. And I've done some research into some conflicts. Nowhere near as deep as I'd hope, but at least some knowledge about the Angolan Civil War or the revolution in Burkina Faso. But there's a long way to go for me to understand anything. But the one lesson I continually come away with when it comes to Russia overall is that there's something sad about what Russia is. And it's not sad in... It's sad in that there is a way that we could look back and realize that the Russia we're dealing with today didn't have to be the Russia it is. The Russia that could have been was always there, but something kept going wrong. No matter what, they just kept getting the worst roll of the die, or somebody tried to make things better. I mean, Yeltsin tried his fucking heart out, and so did Gorbachev, and unfortunately they both essentially put in reforms at what a lot of people tend to consider the wrong time. Right reform, wrong time, or wrong framework, or not enough funding to particular sectors, or whatnot. There's a lot that we can look back and realize that crap went wrong, but no one was really intending it for it to go wrong. It was just a whole bunch of influences that just sort of happened. And that there's something sad about that. But there's also kind of something good about that, in that it also teaches us what Russia is. Doesn't have to be what it can be. And that if we can understand that the Russia now is kind of the consequence of what happened, but that it could have been different, then we could probably do much more today on both the international front, the economic front, several different fronts, to try and make a better future for Russia to exist as a more cooperative partner. Now, obviously, the first step to that, I would say, is you have to first stop their territorial ambition. At this point, the first thing is you gotta deal with a rampaging Russia at this point. Once you get that back into its box, then you can start doing reform work. But right now, we gotta deal with Russia as is. And once we do, we can actually start looking at making a Russia that, it is not as bloodthirsty as it tends to be. But overall, that's just how I tend to see it. I do highly recommend the book. I think it would be a good read for, I guess, anybody who's interested in this sort of sector of not only history, but also geopolitics and how it has influenced that. So I'd highly recommend picking it up for yourself. Thankfully, I've got another book lined up, and we'll see how that goes, though it's like 3 times as large. So it might take a bit longer before I get that one out. Still, thanks for putting up with this for so long, and I hope you have a good one.